It was supposed to be a day of quiet mourning, the kind of somber occasion where every detail is meant to honor the life of a loved one. The air was thick with grief, the kind of heavy silence that falls over a room when the reality of loss becomes undeniable. But then, something happened, something that no one expected, not even the priest. The funeral service had just begun when, in the midst of the hushed prayers and the soft sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside, a dog began barking. Not the usual bark of a dog in the distance, but a loud, desperate bark that echoed through the cemetery. It was almost as if the dog was trying to communicate something important. Now, imagine the scene. A small, family-run funeral gathering in a quiet town. A coffin, draped in flowers, rests at the center of the service, as the priest delivers his words of comfort. But when that dog barks, a chill runs through the crowd. It's not just any bark, there's something more to it. The priest begins to visibly shake. His face turns pale, his words faltering. And then, as if drawn by the sudden tension in the air, a man from the crowd stands up. With a look of confusion, he turns to the priest and asks, "Why are you so nervous? What's going on?" The room falls silent. At first, no one could quite place it. What had made the priest so unnerved by the dog's bark? Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more sinister at play? The man who had asked the question wasn't someone who typically stood out in a crowd. He wasn't family, just a guest of the funeral, a man who had wandered into the service by chance. But his question was about to reveal something that no one could have anticipated. As he spoke, there was an eerie tension that hung in the air, as if the entire gathering had suddenly become aware of something they had been blind to before. The priest, his face still pale, took a deep breath. He hesitated, then finally spoke. "You really want to know?" he asked, his voice trembling. The crowd leaned in, waiting for an answer they didn't know they needed, but something they couldn't ignore. The priest's words were slow, as if he was carefully choosing each one. "It's not just the dog," he began. "It's the timing. You see, there are old stories. Ancient stories, passed down through generations. Stories that speak of a connection between the living and the dead. And this cemetery, well, it's not just any resting place. It's known for strange occurrences. This," he paused, glancing nervously at the coffin, "this isn't the first time something like this has happened." The room grew colder as the priest continued, his voice growing quieter. "There's a belief, a legend, really. When a dog barks at a coffin during a funeral, it's often seen as a warning. A sign that someone, is not at peace. Some say it's a spirit trying to communicate, while others believe it's the soul of the deceased, still trapped between the world of the living and the dead." The man who had asked the question was silent now, his eyes wide, his curiosity piqued. The other guests exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the priest's words sinking in. The dog, still barking from somewhere beyond the gates of the cemetery, seemed to echo the priest's eerie story. "Are you saying the dog is connected to the soul of the departed?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest nodded slowly, his gaze not meeting anyone's eyes. "I'm not saying it is, but it's a possibility. And that's what makes me nervous. Because when these things happen, when the signs appear," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The dog's barking grew louder, more insistent. Some guests began to look out toward the cemetery gates, but no one could see the animal. It was as though it was there, but also not there. Its presence was felt more than seen. The priest took a step back from the coffin, clearly agitated. He turned to the man who had asked the question. "You wouldn't understand unless you've seen it yourself," he said, shaking his head. But the man wasn't deterred. He pressed on, sensing that something deeper was unfolding. "Seen what? What's going on here? Why are you so afraid?" The priest's face twitched as if he was battling with something inside himself. "Because I know what happens next. I know what it means when a dog barks at a coffin during a funeral. And I've seen it happen before. More than once." And then, just as the tension in the air reached its peak, the barking stopped. The stillness that followed felt almost unnatural. It was as if the dog had fulfilled its purpose and left, its message delivered. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The priest's eyes darted around the room, his nerves visibly on edge. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room was suffocating with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves from the trees outside. Finally, the priest turned back to the coffin, his eyes narrowing. "We need to finish this, quickly. There's something we need to do, something that can't wait." As he said this, the door to the chapel creaked open. No one had entered, and yet there was a cold gust of wind. The man, his curiosity now turned into fear, looked from the coffin to the priest. "What do you mean?" he asked. "What needs to be done?" The priest's face hardened, and he took a step forward, his voice barely audible. "You'll find out soon enough. But if we don't act fast, it may be too late." The tension was unbearable. The priest turned back to the coffin, and as he did, the dog began to bark again. The priest's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment the room seemed to freeze. The only sound was the distant barking of the dog, now faint but still relentless. No one moved, no one breathed. All eyes were on the coffin, on the priest, on the man who had asked the question. Then, as if by instinct, the funeral director, a quiet and composed man, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Father," he began cautiously, "perhaps we should proceed. The family will be expecting." But the priest, without looking at him, waved him off. "No, it's too late. We have to deal with this now." The funeral director looked puzzled, but there was an unsettling flicker in his eyes, as if he knew exactly what the priest was referring to. The man who had asked the question, the one who had caused this stir, felt the blood drain from his face. The atmosphere was charged with an ominous energy, as though the walls of the room were closing in. "Father," the man spoke up again, his voice trembling, "what exactly do we need to do? Why is the dog barking like this? What do you know that we don't?" The priest's gaze never left the coffin as he spoke, his voice tight with a mix of fear and resolve. "The dog? It's not just a dog. It's a messenger." The room went still again. The priest's words echoed like a deep, dark warning, and the tension swelled. The man's heart raced. A messenger? But a messenger of what? The priest began to walk toward the back of the chapel, his steps slow, deliberate, as if weighed down by the enormity of what he was about to say. The man followed, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "There's an old story," the priest continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I learned it from my mentor many years ago. It was passed down from generation to generation, even before I became a priest. It's a story about a ritual, one that involves the restless spirits of the dead, and a warning." The man leaned in, hanging on to every word. "A warning about what?" The priest paused, eyes darting nervously around the room. "About souls that don't move on. Souls that remain trapped. And when these souls are not at peace, they sometimes find a way to communicate with the living." The barking, now louder again, seemed to punctuate the priest's words, as if the dog knew the gravity of the situation. "The dog," the priest continued, "is said to be the conduit between the living and the dead. In certain instances, when a dog barks at a coffin, it means that the spirit of the deceased is still lingering, unable or unwilling to cross over. Sometimes it's a sign that the person in the coffin, well, their death wasn't natural. Sometimes it's even worse. Sometimes it means that the spirit of the deceased is angry. And if the proper steps aren't taken, that anger can spill over." The room was now filled with a palpable tension. The man who had asked the question could hardly process what he was hearing, but he had to know more. "And what do we do? What's the ritual? How do we make it stop?" The priest turned slowly, locking eyes with the man. "There's no time to explain it all," he said, voice low, almost to himself. "But I'll tell you this, there are things in this world, things that we don't understand. The dog doesn't bark without a reason. The spirit has chosen this moment to make itself known. It's not just a sign, it's a plea for help." A shiver ran down the man's spine as the weight of the priest's words sank in. A plea for help. That was what the dog's frantic barking was, a cry for attention, a warning that something wasn't right. The priest's face grew darker, and his voice grew strained. "You want to know why I'm nervous? Why I've been hesitant to finish the service? Because I've seen this before. And when a spirit is angry and it doesn't get what it wants, when the living ignore its call, it has consequences. Bad ones. The man could feel his heartbeat quicken. Consequences? What do you mean? The priest looked toward the coffin one last time before turning back to the man. The spirit can haunt this place. It can leave a mark on the living. It can follow them home. And if it gets angry enough, well, I'm sure you don't want to know what happens next. The barking intensified again, as if on cue, and everyone in the chapel turned to look toward the door. The funeral director, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward, his face pale. Father, we need to complete the ritual. Before it's too late. Without another word, the priest walked briskly toward the front of the chapel. The man followed, still trying to process the priest's cryptic warnings. The funeral director, with his back stiff and his steps hurried, moved to open a hidden door behind the altar. This way, he said, motioning for the man and the priest to follow. They entered a small room filled with candles, incense, and various religious items. The priest immediately began preparing, his movements hurried, but precise. The man watched, still unsure of what was going on but feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The priest lit a candle and placed it in front of an old, tattered book. He began chanting in a language the man didn't recognize. The room seemed to grow colder, and the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. "We must act quickly," the priest muttered under his breath. "The spirit is already agitated." The man was torn between his need to understand what was happening and his growing sense of dread. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. The priest looked up at him, his face grim. "I'm performing the rite to release the spirit. It's the only way to ensure that the soul can cross over. If we don't do this, the dog's barking will be the least of our problems." As the priest continued to chant, the room seemed to shift. The man felt an unnatural presence in the air, as though something unseen was moving around them. The candles flickered, the incense smoke twisted in strange patterns, and the sound of the dog's barking grew louder, almost deafening. Then, as if the spirit had heard the priest's chant, there was a sudden, bone-chilling silence. The man turned to see the coffin again, and in that moment, he swore he saw something move within it. His heart raced, his mind screamed that he should leave, but he couldn't. The priest was still chanting, but now there was a flicker of panic in his eyes. "It's happening," he whispered. "Too late. It's already begun." Just as the final words of the chant left the priest's lips, the door to the chapel creaked open, and the barking stopped. In that instant, everything went quiet. The man turned to look at the coffin one last time, his heart hammering in his chest. What he saw next was something he would never forget.